Warning: this program contains flashing lights and scenes some may find disturbing. Humanity should have ended in a global nuclear holocaust on October 27th, 1962. Or at least it would have, if not for one man. He wasn't a person of great influence. In fact, he was rather ordinary. But his quiet act of defiance, under the most strenuous circumstances imaginable, literally saved mankind. The only reason you live and breathe today is because of him. Who is this unknown man who had such a monumental impact on the course of history? And can his tale help us ensure the threats we face today don't spiral into an apocalypse? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the New Mexico desert at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of July, 1945, when humanity crossed a threshold it could never come back from. This was the infamous Manhattan Project's Trinity test, the world's first nuclear bomb. A plutonium device known as Gadget detonated with the force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, releasing twice as much energy as New York City currently uses in a day and creating a fireball 600 meters wide and 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The force of the blast was so powerful, its shockwave could be felt 160 miles away, and its mushroom cloud eventually reached 7.5 miles high, 2 miles higher than Mount Everest. This was destructive power on a scale humanity had never seen before. This is where our story starts, not with the saviour of this terrifying saga, but with the nuclear bomb's creator, Robert Oppenheimer. After finding out his bombs were used to kill around 200,000 innocent Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he realised what he had unleashed upon the world and was plagued with terrifying visions of the future. He knew other superpowers were petrified of the US's newfound capability and would almost certainly replicate his heinous creation to ensure they wouldn't suffer the same fate as Japan. He foresaw an arms race like no other. Nations stockpiling enough atomic arsenal to destroy the entirety of humanity many times over. He believed political tensions would escalate to breaking point by the gargantuan weight of the ever-looming threat of absolute destruction. As such, Oppenheimer desperately requested the US government ban nuclear weapons in a dashed attempt to avert this apocalyptic future. But they ignored him. He no longer controlled his creation. He was no longer death, the destroyer of worlds. As such, he could only see one outcome: nuclear holocaust. Oppenheimer had failed to halt the nuclear arms race. Stopping this inevitable atomic Armageddon fell on the shoulders of another man, 2 decades later. As Oppenheimer predicted, the Soviets developed their own nuclear bomb by 1949 and rapidly grew its nuclear arsenal soon after, spurring on the US to dramatically expand its own. Proxy wars between these two nations broke out across the globe as their ideologies of capitalism and communism clashed. In such a politically charged climate, the US sought safety the only way it knew how: aggression. In 1953, they adopted a position of mass retaliation. In other words, if the Soviets attacked the US, no matter how minor the strike, the US would disproportionately retaliate with nuclear weapons and effectively destroy the Soviet nation. The Soviets, looking to keep their own safety intact, adopted a similar position soon after. In truth, the only way either nation could ensure their safety was to ensure their nuclear threat was larger than the other, which drove a nuclear weapon stockpiling frenzy over the following decades. By 1960, the US and Soviet Union had amassed more than 20,000 nuclear weapons, some with explosive yields thousands of times greater than Gadget, driving political tensions to breaking point. Oppenheimer's visions of the future had come true. All it would take is 400 nuclear weapons, just 2% of the US and Soviet's 1960 atomic arsenal, to wipe out humanity. Oblivion was not only possible, but probable. Indeed, Oppenheimer's visions of global atomic annihilation would have come true, if not for an until recently unknown Russian, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, who stared into the eyes of the apocalypse and said, "Niet." Why did he say no? Well, he was one of only a few people on Earth who had first-hand experience of the horror nuclear technology can cause. Arkhipov was born into a peasant family, but pulled himself out of poverty through the military. He joined the Soviet Navy, and his first deployment was as a minesweeper during the final months of World War II in the Soviet-Japanese War, which started just a few days before the bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. Even though the Soviets were in all-out war with the Japanese, they condemned the US's nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, calling them war crimes. Arkhipov, being on the front line, would have heard of the devastation of these bombings and the official Soviet position on them. As his day-to-day job at the time was detonating some of the largest chemical explosives ever used in war, he was also likely one of the few people who could contextualize just how powerful a nuclear weapon was. But he would soon get far better acquainted with nuclear technology. Arkhipov's stoic and calm nature made him perfect for the Navy. As such, he rose up the ranks rapidly, and over the next 15 years would surf various positions on board Soviet submarines in the Black, Northern and Baltic Seas. In 1961, Arkhipov was appointed Deputy Commander and Executive Officer of the Soviets' first nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine, K-19, and was to accompany it on its maiden voyage. This was meant to be the pinnacle of his career, but it turned into a nightmare. This submarine was hastily built in just over a year in response to the USS George Washington, the world's first nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine. This haste came at a price. Even before its launch, K-19 would take the lives of 11 people during construction. But the submarine's lust for blood wasn't satisfied yet. Just a few days into K-19's maiden voyage, disaster struck. One of K-19's 2 nuclear reactors failed. Its coolant system had completely shut down, and the core temperature skyrocketed. Control rods were automatically inserted into the reactor to stop a meltdown, but the core's temperature still rose uncontrollably to 800 degrees Celsius, and radiation levels around the reactor spiked to fatal levels. To make matters worse, their long-range radio communications were down. The crew were now alone, trapped inside a tin can in the middle of the ocean with an active nuclear disaster, unable to call for help. The engineers came up with a genius solution, but it was a suicide mission. However, they had no other option. The 7-man crew entered the reactor room, exposing themselves to enough radiation to kill them several times over, and jury-rigged a new coolant system. Thankfully, this worked and brought the reactor's temperature back down to safe levels, but it fatally irradiated the engineering crew and their commander, and on top of that, accidentally released irradiated steam into the vessel's ventilation system, irradiating the entire crew. K-19 had mostly averted a major nuclear incident, and they could now limp back home. But the engineering crew and their commander wouldn't make it. Death by radiation poisoning is a deeply horrifying way to go. Victims can outwardly seem fine initially, but the biological systems that keep their cells alive are obliterated. The first signs of anything being wrong is the appearance of giant burns and lacerations. Over the course of hours or days, organs start to literally fall apart while the victim is still alive, causing excessive bleeding, rampant infections, seizures, vomiting blood, diarrhea, blackouts, and even psychosis. Eventually, the neurological, respiratory, and cardiovascular systems fail and the victim dies. But that could be days after initial symptoms start to show. Death by radiation is a literal hell. Arkhipov had to watch his fellow crew members go through such a horrific death with no appropriate medical assistance, all while not being able to contact Moscow for help and not knowing if he would share the same fate. To add to their pain, Soviet naval leaders would mock the crew of the K-19 when they returned home, disregarding what they went through as trivial. Meanwhile, the rank and file of the Soviet Navy would dub K-19 Hiroshima, a name they would not use lightly. Arkhipov had experienced firsthand how savage, traumatic, and deleterious nuclear technology can be. Not only that, but also how military leadership had no concept and no respect for how ruinous it could potentially be. No doubt, these experiences would deeply shape his actions just a year later, when off the coast of Cuba, he would single-handedly stop nuclear Armageddon. But how did Arkhipov end up off the coast of Cuba? Well, back in 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution and toppled the nation's US-friendly dictator, Fulgencio Batista. He then went about turning Cuba into his vision of a communist utopia, and in the process, nationalized US banks and businesses on the island. At the time, the US was aggressively against any form of communism. It was the height of the Cold War after all. As such, the CIA planned to overthrow Castro by funding and training American-based Cuban exiles to form a counter-revolutionary military unit known as Brigade 2506. Then President Kennedy was informed they could easily topple Castro. So on his orders, the 1,400-strong paramilitary landed in the Bay of Pigs, Cuba on the 17th of April 1961 and tried to tear down Castro's government. However, Brigade 2506 was utterly crushed. Not only did this monumental failure paint Kennedy out as weak, but it also pushed Castro closer to the Soviet Union. He realized Cuba would need serious defensive power, and the Soviets were the only ones who could provide them with that. This is why Arkhipov was off the coast of Cuba in 1962. You see, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw this as an opportunity to level the playing field with the US. At the time, the US had the nuclear advantage, as the US could strike almost anywhere within the Soviet Union, but no major US cities were within striking range of the Soviet nuclear missiles. Khrushchev believed that after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy would back away, leaving Cuba free of American meddling. So, Khrushchev planned to install Soviet-controlled nuclear missiles in Cuba in secret, providing Castro with the protection he sought and placing every major US city within striking range of the Soviets, levelling the nuclear playing field. Time was of the essence, and the Soviets wasted none. In July 1962, the first of many armed Soviet cargo ships landed in Cuba, carrying Soviet missiles that could hit targets 2,300 miles away with a 1 megaton nuclear warhead. In other words, these missiles could hit Washington DC, New York City, or even Las Vegas with a bomb 66 times more powerful than the one that flattened Hiroshima. But Castro was terrified of what the US would do when they found out about these missiles. So Soviet military leadership promised to send nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed November-class submarines that could stay submerged for months at a time, along with a large fleet of powerful surface vessels to defend Cuba from American aggression while these missiles were being installed. Castro was right to worry. The US was already onto them. That August, a covert CIA U-2 surveillance flight over Cuba gave the US its first clue that something was going on when it uncovered military compound upgrades on the island, most likely for nuclear weaponry. As such, it's not surprising the Soviets had second thoughts about sending such a powerful fleet so close to the US mainland. So they opted instead to send the 69th Torpedo Submarine Brigade. This consisted of 4 diesel-electric Foxtrot-class submarines commanded by Vasily Arkhipov. In fact, this was Arkhipov's first post as commander. The Foxtrot-class submarine was far less capable than the November-class. They weren't built with nuclear capability and could only stay submerged for a maximum of 5 days. So, to make up for these shortcomings, these Foxtrots had been hastily fitted with a 15 kiloton T5 nuclear torpedo, capable of sinking an entire US fleet in one go before departing for Cuba. But again, this haste came at a cost, as it always does. For one, the US didn't know about this modification, and so wouldn't treat these submarines as nuclear-armed vessels. Remember that for later. There was also no specific instructions about the use of the T5. All that was established was that the captain and the political officer had to agree for it to be launched, but they were never told what circumstances justified a launch. Reportedly, the Chief of Staff of the Northern Fleet told the captains, "I suggest to you, commanders, that you use the nuclear weapons first, and then you will figure out what to do after that." What's more, the decision to send Arkhipov's brigade rather than the more capable nuclear submarines happened so fast that Soviet military leaders weren't informed. As such, Arkhipov was given orders his submarines physically couldn't comply with, making the order to press the nuclear button unavoidable. So let's just recap this and let it sink in. On the 1st of October 1962, 4 submarines left Kola Bay for Cuba under the command of Arkhipov. The vessels weren't up to the job, as they could only stay submerged for 5 days, making discovery and combat with the Americans inevitable. The Soviet command itself was unaware of the switch of submarines, so gave orders to stay submerged longer than they could, and gave them incomplete nuclear launch protocols to fire first, think later. What's more, the US had not been informed that these submarines were now nuclear armed, meaning they likely wouldn't treat them with the delicate tactics necessary to avert a nuclear exchange. Arkhipov was likely aware of all this, but what he wasn't yet aware of was that he was sailing straight towards the most dangerous political storm humanity had ever faced: the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the 4th of October, while Arkhipov was sailing through the Norwegian Sea, Another armed Soviet cargo ship landed in Cuba with a shipment of 160 nuclear warheads, enough to destroy every major US city. So far, Khrushchev's plan seemed to be going smoothly, but they were quickly rumbled. On the 14th of October, another U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and found operational Soviet missile sites in Cuba. This started the Cuban Missile Crisis. On receiving this intelligence, Kennedy panicked. He couldn't let the Soviets encroach on the US like this, but couldn't risk starting a nuclear war. He needed a way to decisively stop Khrushchev, somehow without placing the US in the nuclear crosshairs. What he came up with was quite tactful. On the 17th of October, Kennedy ordered the US Navy to covertly establish a naval quarantine to keep any further Soviet military vessels from reaching Cuba, with plans to demand the missiles be removed once it is set up. At the same time, Kennedy had to do some prep work to ensure his allies came to America's aid if nuclear war kicked off. So that same day, Kennedy announced to the world that the US would regard any nuclear missile launch from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Arkhipav's crew would have picked up this transmission and only then discovered they were sailing straight towards a possible all-out nuclear war. As the political environment metaphorically heated up above water, the physical conditions on board Arkhipav's submarine became literally scorching thanks to the warm Atlantic waters around Cuba. These vessels weren't designed for tropical waters, and Moscow's impossible orders to stay submerged longer than they actually could stopped them from properly ventilating out the vessel. As such, the conditions on board B-59, the submarine Arkhipov was actually on, became a living hell. Temperatures reached 65 degrees Celsius, and operators couldn't use machinery without burning themselves. Mission-critical equipment such as the desalination system started to fail in the heat. As such, there was only enough clean water for each crew member to have a single cup of water a day. Oxygen levels on board dipped dangerously low while carbon dioxide levels spiked. The crew, unable to wash themselves, started to suffer from trench foot and agonizing rashes. Many began to faint from heat stroke. Those crew that stayed conscious were lying about in the vessel in their underwear, quivering, suffering from horrific cramps, shortness of breath, and severe mental confusion due to the heat, dehydration, and hypoxia brought on by the lack of oxygen. These were the very people authorized to press the nuclear button, yet most of them could barely stay conscious. Not ideal conditions for the crew of a nuclear-armed vessel entering the most potentially destructive conflict of all time. But they had a mission to carry out. On the 22nd of October, they were nearing Cuba and made their final submergence beneath the waves. Later that same day, Kennedy announced to the world via a radio broadcast that the US had found unmistakable evidence of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, and that the world was teetering on the cusp of thermonuclear war. He also announced his remarkably astute countermove of a naval quarantine of Cuba, while demanding the Soviets removed their missiles. However, he negated to mention how the US Navy would deal with Soviet military vessels. Arkhipov heard this transmission and knew without a shadow of a doubt that they were just a step away from thermonuclear war, and that the most powerful and sophisticated naval force of all time was hunting them down. As such, he dove as deep as possible to avoid detection. But critically, this would also block them from receiving any more radio communications, isolating them from the rest of the world. Diving deep was initially a smart move, as later that day, while Arkhipov was still somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, 90 US warships established the quarantine. However, on the 25th of October, the US sent a letter to the Soviets detailing how they would use 4 or 5 harmless explosive sound signals to force submarines to surface at the quarantine. This is vital information for Arkhipov to know, as this would enable him to decipher between a US attack and the US simply signaling them. But no matter how hard Soviet leadership tried to tell Arkhipov, he couldn't get the message. He was simply too deep to receive it. The trap was set. Everything was in place for the dominoes to fall and a humanity-ending nuclear Armageddon to be unleashed upon the world. The B-59 at its nucleus. By the 27th of October, B-59's batteries were nearly flat, and they were a stone's throw away from Cuba. The crew had endured literally torturous conditions for well over a week at this point. Some crew members were close to death, and those still conscious were barely holding on to their sanity or cognitive ability. Then, at 4:59 p.m, B-59 experienced 5 terrible, ear-splitting, hull-rattling explosions. They had been found. Ten US Navy destroyers, led by the giant aircraft carrier USS Randolph, had located B-59 and were trying to force it to surface as per the quarantine procedures. But no one on board B-59 had been informed of these. As such, these explosions sounded like submarine sinking depth charges. Then, at 5:29 p.m, 5 more explosions rocked B-59. Hundreds of meters beneath the surface, in their delirious near-death state with no contact from the outside world, the captain of the B-59, Valentin Savitsky, snapped. With no contact from Moscow in days, he had no way of knowing if war had broken out. The scant information they did have suggested that not only was war probable, but that it would be nuclear, with potentially hundreds of missiles launched by each side, with military and naval forces unleashing the entirety of their destructive force at each other. B-59 was cornered. It couldn't escape the Americans, its batteries were flat, and the Americans weren't likely to miss them a third time, meaning they might just have minutes before being obliterated. They couldn't surface and surrender either, as if there was a nuclear war going on, the Americans would just destroy them before they could fly a white flag and move on. No matter which direction he turned, Savitsky saw death. But he had a third option, the T-5, their nuclear torpedo. If they were going to perish, Savitsky wanted to take the US fleet with them. He decided to fire their nuclear torpedo. He ordered it to be assembled to battle readiness and started the process required to fire it. According to the testimony of those on board that day, Savitsky screamed, "Maybe the war has already started up there, while we are doing somersaults here," followed by, "We are going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet," as he tried to justify his orders to his commander, Vasily Arkhipov, and the submarine's political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. After a heated debate, Maslenikov agreed with Savitsky and opted to launch the fleet killer T-5 torpedo at the USS Randolph. This would have been enough for the T-5 to launch, destroying the US fleet in a catastrophic nuclear explosion, sparking an actual humanity-ending global nuclear war. But by pure happenstance, Arkhipov had chosen B-59 to command the submarine fleet from. meaning he also had to agree for it to be launched. The fate of the world now lay in Archipov's hands. Archipov was staring the apocalypse directly into the eyes. He knew launching the T-5 would start a nuclear war if one hadn't already started, but his comrades were ready to fight a war that would have no victors, only victims, and he was now the only person that could stop them. It would be easy to agree to the launch. That was their orders after all. And from their perspective, they were going to die anyway. But undoubtedly, Archipov thought back to the excruciating deaths of his irradiated crewmates from the K-19. He knew better than anyone the suffering they were about to inflict. Millions would die as atomic bombs rained down from the sky like a meteor shower across east and west alike. Those lucky few who survived the blast would have to experience their own bodies slowly disintegrating from radiation or starve to death in the barren wastelands that were once human civilization. How could he do that to so many people? Even if such a war had already started, how could he partake in such destruction? Through his dehydrated, heat-exhausted, hypoxic state, and with the screams of his old crewmates mingling with the frantic outbursts of Savitsky and ringing in his ears, Archipov uttered a single word that would save humanity. Niet. A vicious argument broke out amongst Savitsky, Maslenikov and Archipov. But Archipov stood his ground and was able to convince Savitsky to sonar ping the Americans to test their intentions and, if all is okay, surface and await orders from Moscow. In this moment, not only was Archipov defying his orders to fire first, but also placing the entire vessel in a potentially catastrophic situation. A sonar ping would give the Americans their exact location, so if this was war, such an act would kill them all. But Archipov was willing to place his and his crewmates' necks on the chopping block if it meant avoiding a global apocalypse. But how to convince Savitsky? Well, Savitsky and Maslenikov knew about K-19 and had enormous respect for Archipov for his actions during the disaster. This, combined with Archipov's stoicism and calm demeanour, helped bring Savitsky down from the precipice. Savitsky ordered the sonar ping. The deafening sound rang throughout the excruciatingly hot vessel. If this isn't followed up by more depth charges, it means they aren't engaged in combat, and war hasn't broken out. I cannot possibly imagine how tense this must have been for Archipov. He had called a bluff on the nuclear apocalypse whilst holding a dead man's hand. Had he called it right? Or had he single-handedly signed away every soul on board's life? Minutes passed by of excruciating silence. Archipov waited and waited, and all he could hear was the deafening sound of silence. There was no war. Archipov was right. They surfaced by 8:30 p.m. and were greeted by the US fleet without aggression. Just 15 minutes later, news arrived to both the US fleet and the B-59 that the Soviet Union and United States had decided to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets would remove their Cuban missiles in return for the US removing their missiles from Turkey. So Savitsky would have started a world-ending nuclear war moments before the conflict was resolved, if not for Arkhipov, who was only on his vessel by total chance. The shame and guilt Savitsky and Maslenikov must have felt upon hearing this news had to have been soul-crushing. The other 3 submarines in the fleet had all also been surfaced by the US Navy, but none of them ever came close to using their T-5s. When all the submarines could finally communicate with Moscow, they were ordered to return to the Soviet Union. B-59 took several days to make repairs, ventilate and cool down the vessel, and run its engines and charge its batteries. Then, on the 29th of October, B-59 submerged without warning, escaping the US fleet, and slowly returned to port. The Soviet Union kept this incident a state secret for decades. More than that, the captains and Arkhipov were faced with disgrace from Soviet leadership, just like with the K-19. One admiral told them, "It would have been better if you'd gone down with your ship." Arkhipov and the captains would have likely faced far harsher punishments, if not for said leadership finding out on their return that the submarines weren't the nuclear-powered November-class fleet that could stay submerged for over a month, and that it was their misinformed orders that created this near world-ending calamity. Reportedly, upon hearing this news, Marshal Andrei Grechko removed his glasses and hit them against the table in fury, breaking them into small pieces and abruptly leaving the room. It wasn't until 4 years after Arkhipov's death in 2002 that the world would officially learn of his courageous actions. This came as a huge shock to the US, who for decades believed that B-59 and her brigade only carried conventional weapons. Later that year, Thomas S. Blatton, then director of the US National Security Archive, credited Arkhipov as the man who saved the world. This was far from hyperbole, as upon finding out about the B-59's tale, the Pentagon estimated that had the T-5 been launched, it would have sparked a nuclear war, leading to at least 150 million deaths, and a nuclear winter in the Northern Hemisphere that would have claimed vastly more lives, and rendering North America, Europe and Asia near unlivable for well over a decade. The Russian government, in contrast, didn't comment on the revelation. This brings me on to the relevance of Arkhipov's story today. It's safe to say that the world is facing multiple threats just as potentially destructive as Arkhipov did that day. The apparent lessons from Arkhipov's story are not to follow authority blindly, keep a cool head, put humanity in front of the individual, and apply these morals even under the most extreme physical and psychological pressures. Indeed, we can solve all the global challenges that we currently face if we all did this. But Arkhipov was 1 in a million, 1 in 100 million. He was superhuman, and the vast majority of us lack his ability. But another critical lesson we can also take from this chapter of history is that if you can't be like Arkhipov, be more like Savitsky. I can see how it is easy to paint him as the villain. He was desperate to press the nuclear button, but what he did do was come back from the brink. You see, in times of stress, we tend to reach for extreme, unproven solutions provided by strong individuals. That is how we ended up in the world of Trump, Brexit, and New Age authoritarianism. All things which don't actually solve the problem at hand and actually make it demonstrably worse. This is what Savitsky did. He initially followed the extreme orders of fire first, think later, but climbed down. Under unimaginable pressure, he managed to recognize that Arkhipov had the mentality, rationality, experience, and track record needed to steer them through safely. So Savitsky took his ego out of the equation, stepped aside, and trusted him. In doing so, he also saved the world. We all have the capacity to do the same. We can overcome our questionable cultural programming and ego by realizing we can become the quiet Superman of our story through introspective, mildly empathetic critical thinking. Only then will we be able to support and enable those who have proven themselves to be genuine, calm, selfless, and rational leaders, like Savitsky did, and discard the extreme, self-enriching, manipulative, false heroes that dominate today's landscape and threaten our very existence. Imagine what the world would be like if we did this. Wars raging today would have never started. Democracy wouldn't be profoundly threatened. We could have actually taken actions needed to stop climate change and not enrich billionaires at the cost of our beautiful world. Women, minorities, LGBTQ+, immigrants, and even human rights wouldn't be repeatedly violated as scapegoats to protect broken political ideologies. In short, the world would be a better and safer place. So while this documentary celebrates the incredible unsung achievements of Arkhipov, it also celebrates the quieter but no less critical actions of Savitsky. Together, they have shown us how to save the world. Now it is our turn to put these lessons into action.